everyone, and welcome to We Go Back. I'm your host, Bryan Abou Chacra, and on this week's episode, we will be reviewing all the best Cowboys have daddy issues, and whatever the case may be, the 11th and 12th episode of the first season of Lost. I had to turn pages to look that up. These two had very long titles for their episodes. But anyways, let's hop right into all the best Cowboys have daddy issues. This is actually the first episode of Lost that I ever saw. I was over at a buddy's house. I was over at Eric's house, and he had it on TV, and I was watching it, and I was intrigued, but I was also like, man, this show looks like it's going to be a lot to get into. So I remember I watched this whole episode and went through it without having any background or substance to it, and kind of enjoying the show, kind of piqued my interest, but it wasn't until actually season 2 that I really started to go back and like get into the show. But I figured you guys would want to know when I sort of jumped into Lost. It was around this episode. Really funny one for me to see, because all I saw was Pippin, I think it was. I think he played Pippin in Lord of the Rings. I forget. I get it mixed up all the time. Anyhow, we have this episode where Claire seems to have been abducted by Ethan, and what the hell is happening? So there's a guy who was part of the plane crash, or pretending to be part of the plane crash, and he just abducted a pregnant woman, and this other guy, Charlie. What is happening? Are there actually other people on the island, like is being suggested? Like we had Saeed being told by the French woman, Danielle, that there are other people here and she hears voices, and then we kind of experience that, and now we have this guy abducting a woman. Like, man, it was nuts. What is going on in this show? We're losing it. So anyways, everybody's going out to try to get Claire back. John and Jack are kind of arguing on how to try to find Claire, and Locke really wants Jack to stop and prepare and like go back and kind of get a group together, so that he can really get this done correctly, because they don't know what's gonna go on. I mean, if Ethan is actually part of another group of people on the island, there may be others waiting for them, and they would be better off with numbers. But Jack, is just being impulsive here, and in these situations, it seems like Jack is just impulsive, and he just wants to go try to get Claire back, and they tussle over that. And in that same time, you have Michael, who wants to come and help them out as well, and we just hear him sort of shut down Walt about trying to help, using Vincent as a guide dog or a search dog to go try to get a scent of either Charlie or Claire, so that they might be able to track her better. And he kind of just shuts down Walt, and I think Locke refusing him here is Locke doing the same thing to Michael that he just did to his son, so maybe he could gain some perspective. I really feel like that's something here where Locke is trying to sort of guide people into seeing things that they might not have seen before. But I think that's really cool that he then sort of tasks Michael with doing something on his own, like, okay, well, if you want to not have somebody direct you, then why don't you take the initiatives, get some people together, and head south, since I'll be heading north, so we can cover opposite territory. And Michael's kind of shook up by that, but I think that's really interesting that we see that bit of a play between Locke and Michael. They both are trying to figure out what they have to do to secure and find Claire and Charlie, so that they can be returned back to the caves. Anyhow, moving on, we're going to go into the first flashback with Jack and his dad, and it's Jack's dad telling Jack to call a girl on his table that was brought in from an accident. We find out there's a bit of a dispute about what happened, that maybe Jack's dad, his name is Christian, we find out, might have been drunk during the operation. That's why Jack was there. And this causes a very severe rift for Jack and his dad, because Jack has always sort of seen his father as this great surgeon, this thing to look up to, and the standard bearer, and he has what it takes, is what he told his son before. And now he's operating under the influence, and that's really messing with Jack. He's kind of got this noble spirit and wants to do the best for the good of the people. And then he also has emotional attachments to his father. So he's torn between what he knows is right objectively, and then, his family. And his father wants him to basically lie about the fact that that he had a few drinks during lunch, because the moment alcohol would be involved into this hearing, or Jack's dad would lose his license. It would be done. He would be fired, and his whole life would be over. And he sort of coerces Jack into it. And Jack kind of came in, I felt like, with this, knight in shining armor sort of feeling, and was sort of coerced into his father because of his emotional tie. And I think that talks about a very interesting theme in this episode, which is, I think this episode talks a lot about the perception of knowing what to do or knowing what's right. Especially when you're considering like a larger group of people, not just for yourself. But, and I think you really see that dynamic come through with Jack and his dad, Jack and Locke. They argue about how to sort of search for Claire, with Locke and Michael about how they're going to search for Claire and the way that they're going to do it, and Locke not wanting his help. And then of course back down to Michael and Walt, where Walt has an idea of what he thinks can help and actually try to aid the search for Claire. And he and his father sort of have that clash as well of what they should do also. So I think it's really interesting to see that dynamic in this episode really pop up as a theme for a lot of the characters. So I want to go back to Jack and how he's treating himself because of Claire and Charlie's abduction. He's like really manic in his state. He's really like beating himself up, almost in the way that we've seen his father beat him up, or not beat him up, but reprimand him for making a mistake. And it's really, like I said, manic. You can see he's struggling with feeling responsible for something that he couldn't possibly be responsible for. He had to use his best diagnosis about what was going on with Claire. Like I explained in the last episode, he just thought that she was going through some sort of stressful thing because she's on this island, she's going to have the baby, she's not ready to do that, it's not the ideal conditions, and she just might be having distress. That's reasonable given their situation. But now that he ended up being wrong, he expected himself to be right. And I think you can really see that in how he wears it for his character in this part of the show, or in this part of the episode. You really see him kind of getting down on himself as if it was something that he could have prevented, even though he really couldn't have. So they come upon two different trails, and they think one might be a dummy trail, one might be the real trail. So they split up, and Kate and Jack go together while Boone and Locke go off together to try to find Claire. And then we find out from Walt that Sawyer has no idea what's going on with the abduction, with Claire, with anybody. And he's getting all of his information right now from Walt about what's going on, and finds out that Saeed is back, which you can tell kind of shakes him up. And we'll get back to that in a little bit, but you can kind of see it in there that he's a little bit set aback by Saeed being back so soon. I don't think he expected him to return. And it's interesting, their interaction later. I think the conversation that we have between John and Boone about what John did when he wasn't on the island, living his crippled bored life in Tustin, California, as what we find out is a collections supervisor. He was a collections agent. He collected past debts that companies or people had with them for a box company, and Boone doesn't believe it. And I think this again shows the strength of choices and what you do with opportunity, which I think are themes that come along. Opportunity in this case for John kind of being his faith in the island, because he seems to be, and as we find in this episode and in the next, that he's sort of following a feeling or intuition, and it's leading him to these very interesting revelations. So very, very cool to see the stark comparison of what he actually used to do in the real world in his boring and crippled life as the broken man that he was, and what he is giving himself to be in the island. I think that's really, really cool. I think it's interesting to talk more about like discovering oneself here. We discover more about Kate when she describes how she learned how to track from her dad. So we know that there is a dynamic there with her and her dad. You can tell that she has something very emotional and a strong connection to her dad. And one of the things that again makes Lost and its writing and its everything so cool and subtle is that she's able to like have that emotion. You can see that she had a strong connection with her father without having to be so telly. Like and by telly I mean telling. Like they show you in the way that she acts. They don't just tell you what happens, and you get a feeling from it because you can see it worn on the character as if it was part of their personality, not just lines or action that they've been told to deliver by a director. So I think that's cool. Like that emotion comes through a lot in Lost, and that's really cool. And then that takes us back to Jack, who comes into his meeting with his father. This meeting where his dad's trying to convince him to switch his opinion on what happened, or not opinion really, but the fact of what happened, by describing the emotional side of it and the sacrifice his father made with his relationship with him so that he could do the greater good for everybody else around him. And he's appealing to his son in this way. And I feel like Jack came in here with like an eagerness to give his father a lesson the same way that his father used to give him, to tell him about like the greater good and making that decision that he does have to make, and that he has what it takes because he's able to even do it to his father if his father steps out of line. And then his father clouds his decision with emotion and telling him about the sacrifices and everything like that. But I think it was so interesting to see that eagerness in Jack. I hadn't really noticed that before. Sort of like to knock his father down a peg and be like, see what you did to me. And I think his dad recognizes it here. He says it in the scene. He says, I know I've been hard on you. And it really feels like he's being sincere. But we see later in an interaction that Christian has with somebody else, that it's a little less genuine than we thought it was. So let's move on from there. Because Jack's really torn with doing what's right and what the best decision is emotionally and for his father and blah blah blah. But we'll get back to that in a little bit. We get to Sawyer and Saeed in the caves. Sawyer comes up on him, passed out, and asks Saeed to tell him what happened while he was gone, and it's explained to him. And Sawyer is a little skeptical, but he also believes him. I think he has a respect and now has like a little bit more of a reverence for Saeed. Saeed has like more credibility with him. And so he wants to know what happened while he was gone. Because I don't think Sawyer really has a grudge against him, which I believe is what happens here at the end of this conversation. I don't know if you guys caught that as well, but like I feel like Sawyer is coming to say, "Hey man, I kept your signal fire going because I respect what you're doing here. We may have had our tussles, but I respect you a little bit more, and I'll let bygones be bygones here." Because I feel like that was him burying the hatchet. He realized he was also being quite a dick in that instance, and he asked for it, so it wasn't solely Saeed's fault. And I think he's telling him we're letting bygones be bygones. I want to talk a little bit about the scene here where Walt's playing backgammon with Hurley, and talk about how his other dad called him the luckiest person he's ever met. I want to point out here that this is possibly a tie-in to how so far there has been a supernatural kind of feeling around Walt, where he's in the scene. You can see him basically getting every role that he needs. And then before that, he wants Michael to go look for his dog. And his dad said, as soon as it stops raining, I'm going to go get it. And then it stops raining immediately. So this is another instance that Walt has something that might be a little different than other people. We also know he's reading a comic book in Spanish, and there's a polar bear that is in that book. I don't know if you guys could see that in the book, but there is one. And then that ends up being a polar bear that they see on the island. Does he have some sort of connection or some sort of like clairvoyance? Who knows? But pay attention. Like I said, I'll point out these little points to you every time I come across them so that you guys can see them for yourselves as well. So, anyhow, I want to talk a little bit about John knowing when it's going to rain. I think this goes back to what I was saying earlier about him giving sort of a faith to the island and following his intuition with it, and maybe being able to have some sort of ability to read it. Stuff like this I want you guys to pay attention to with John, like what are his motivations and how he seems to be driven. You can see a lot of what gives him his motivation and drive by stuff like this, by his comments and how he behaves. So that's why I want to bring it up. Nothing like too significant about it there. It's just kind of like a cool little, wow, how could he do that? How did he know when it was going to rain? And I think it's because they're trying to tell us something about John. So I think it's good to keep paying attention to things like this. Then Jack, we have his little altercation with Ethan, and gets threatened, says that he will kill one of them, and beats Jack up and leaves him in the ground. We've never seen Jack physically manhandled like this at all before, or anybody really. And it seems like Ethan's like very strong compared to Jack, and that could be a number of things. Apparently if this guy is from here, he probably knows the lay of the land a little better, so he's not as tired. He's not chasing somebody. So, it might just be the fatigue and the mental state that Jack is in, but man, this guy can really put him down pretty quick. But this leads to a really cool part where we see Jack's dad having that conversation with the woman who had died on their table. It's her husband. He's in grief. He's threatening to sue. And Jack sees that same sort of hand pat onto the grieving husband, onto the widower, we'll call him, and sort of sees that as a tell that his father is lying to him and that he's being manipulated. And they're establishing in this episode that Jack really does not appreciate when he's being manipulated. And that really strikes a chord with Jack and comes back a little bit later on when we see the hearing, and Jack finds out that the woman was actually pregnant. And as far as I understand in the medical world, one of the things that is most important about treating a patient is knowing as much about the history of what brought them into your office today as you can, so that you don't contaminate with another procedure or something like that. So I think Jack not knowing that the woman was a mother, that she was with a child, like he might have tried harder. And the fact that he didn't know that and had to kind of give it up on it just being the woman really struck a chord with him. Like he wasn't given that opportunity to try to save her child at least, so that there would be, a possibility for life with this child. However, you hear them say in that scene that the woman was very, very early on. And in cases like that, the focus has to be on the mother. Apparently there's a scale. At least that's what I've seen on television, medical television, but I've also heard that from people in the medical field. So I'm not entirely sure. If I'm wrong, like I said, always let me know. But I think that bit of information, Jack not knowing that there was a child in there, really stuck with him and caused him to be very altruistic and tell on his father and really get down and tell him exactly what happened, and that his father was drunk, and that the woman probably died because of him, and that 2 lives were lost because of his father, not just the one woman's life. And it wasn't just some freak accident. So, that again, or not again, but that is then juxtaposed with them finding Charlie strung up, and they cut him down and they're trying to resuscitate him, and they do eventually get him to life, but man, they really make you feel like he's gone, and they make you feel like, just like the woman on the table, that's it, man. Like, and I remember watching this for the first time being like, this is the episode I tuned into. One of the characters from Lord of the Rings, the only other thing I know about the show is gonna die on the episode that I tuned into. And man, they really stuck it in there to make you believe that he was gone, but it ends up that he's not, and Jack brings him, and then, as I noticed here for the first time, kind of holds him like a child, like a child being born and seeing the light for the first time. Let's get really deep. Let's say that the vines that he was strung up to were like the umbilical cord that he was, being reborn in and cut down. He's taken off fate down to the E on his hands from the little sticky tape. Maybe this is Jack's redemption from the story we've seen in the last scene. It could be, might not be, who knows? But I think it's something to definitely note while you're watching this and looking back at it. But I also think that it's really interesting, the way that this scene is shot for Charlie. It shows him shot with that crown that is typical for like Byzantine Catholic representations of Christ and the apostles, or I forget what they're all called, but yeah, all of that kind of stuff. Look that stuff up. It looks like how Charlie is laid down, and this is a interesting theme for him because we do know that he is Catholic. He's gone to confession in previous episodes, so it's interesting to see him shot with that behind him. But yeah, Charlie is back. He did not die, and man, that's really good because we really like Charlie. He's so much fun. We've just seen him kick a habit and trying to get with Claire and be helpful for her. I remember just feeling like, really? Like, now already? But that takes us to John, who is obviously really not looking for Claire. He's not even on the right trail as it's been established, and he is looking for something else. And in following his gut and following a feeling, they stumble across something that's metal and in the ground, and now they're going to excavate it and figure out what the heck is there and what's going on. And that takes us to the end of that episode. We will now move on to whatever the case may be, episode 12. This episode, I really wanted to focus on something really cool here. It sucks because it's cool. I want you guys to watch the episodes and then, come back here and maybe get a little bit more explanation. But then when I point out things like the music in the scenes, and especially in this episode, you kind of have to just go back and watch it. If you weren't paying attention to it for the first time, you're going to have to watch it again and pay attention to it. You don't have to. You don't have to do anything I say. But if you feel like it, it's cool to go back and listen and see, the music in this episode. I even got an email about it, which prompted and piqued my interest. I'll bring it up at the end of the episode. But it made me pay a little bit more attention to the music. Plus, it just stood out on its own here. And I think it really sets a lot of the emotion of this episode. And music really is what captures a lot of emotion in media. So it's cool to have an episode that's a little bit more not focused, but has that featured more prominently. Especially with, you get this very different feel from the music here with Kate being up in the trees, getting apples. It's a little less sinister. It's more of like bright, like a morning theme, like really calm, very different from what we've heard in Lost so far. And then when we hear that noise, that distraction, all of a sudden it switches and it's that very tense, very string heavy, like violin sound, that urgent, that calm and quiet. And it's just a cool way to make you really feel the difference and feel the setting of a scene. And here it really points it out with Sawyer. He was out trying to, make sure Kate was okay by following her and keeping his distance just in case there were some other abductors or something horrible that could happen to her, because as we know, he does care about her. And in their little interaction, she throws a rock at him, and they end up discovering a waterfall. And the music again shifts in this scene. That's why I'm spending so much time describing more of the scene here than I am talking about interesting points. There's nothing really unique here, but part of watching Lost is paying attention to all of the points of detail. There's a reason this first season, if you want to look it up, this first season was nominated for so many awards, so many Emmys, and it won like pretty much all of them because it had such great writing, it had such great costume design and makeup and music, cinematography, lighting, everything. I don't want to go off on the list, but I'm pretty sure it was up for so many things. Best actor, best supporting, best ensemble. I'm pretty sure it was up for a lot. Like, Lost was really different. There weren't shows like Lost that felt this big and produced so well, especially this first season. So really something to take a look at while you're going back and watching Lost and going through these seasons, or watching it for the first time. Try to really think about how nothing was like it before Lost. Nothing at all. You didn't have this big kind of thing. The only other thing you had close to it were HBO shows like The Sopranos, but even that was a very different type of show. And maybe one day we'll talk about Sopranos, but let's get back into the episode right now. They end up going into this little lagoon with the waterfall and jumping off the rocks and playing around in the fountain. One thing that I noticed here about the rocks that I hadn't paid attention to the first several times that I had watched it is that, correct me if I'm wrong, please email me, wegobackpodcast@gmail.com, and tell me if you disagree or tell me if you do agree. I felt like the rocks here looked like ruins, and I hadn't really noticed that before, that they weren't just natural formations. And yeah, that might have been a set. I doubt it. I think that was a lot of the show Lost was really shot out on location where they were, in Hawaii, and I think in Oahu or Maui, I forget. Doesn't matter. But I wonder if those rock formations were meant to kind of look like ruins, because I wonder if that was something that was just hidden in there that I didn't notice before. I'll pay attention. Maybe it comes back up later, but I was pretty interested to see that, or to make that recognition this time. I am also watching this show and taking notes as I'm doing it, so sometimes I might read into stuff too much. But let's get back to them finding the bodies, which leads to them finding a case, a Halliburton that Kate claims is hers, and she wants Sawyer to give it to him, give it to her, but he, realizing it's not actually hers, takes it for his, because he thinks she has no claim over it. And that sets up for a pretty interesting story arc for this episode, of course. But one thing that I pointed out here that always got under my skin was when they're sitting there and talking about the case and everything, they're putting on their clothes while they're still like totally soaked wet. Like, how can you do that? Have you ever done that if you've gone to a pool, or the beach, or wherever you guys swim if you don't have a beach? It's the weirdest thing to put clothes back on when you have wet clothes underneath. Like, why just walk through the jungle with your wet clothes? I mean, I get that they're basically in whatever. Anyways, huge tangent. Just always stuck out to me. And I felt like pointing it out to you guys, because I wondered if you noticed it too. We cut to Jack on the beach trying to talk to Saeed to figure out where Rousseau is so that he can try to find Claire. And Saeed is unsure of what he had heard and about the other people on the island, and how Rousseau was very lonely and is very distraught and doesn't know if he can guide Jack back to him. Basically just refuses to do so. But we see that obviously getting Claire is still a main priority for these people. She's about to have a kid and everything. And then on top of that, we see Boone, who's now talking to Shannon, telling her that he's going out and trying to find Claire, when we know from the last episode he's found something with John, and that's kind of what he's going to do. He went to stop by there to pick something up and come back out to the beach, or come back out to where Locke is, and finds Shannon just sitting there being Shannon, not doing a thing, calls her useless, and she's distraught by this. All she's ever heard from her family is that she's useless and doesn't do anything, and she's pissed off. And that's something I want to point out because it comes back later to an interaction she has in the episode, so pay attention to that. We get our flashback this week. In this episode, we're focusing on Kate, and under another name is at a bank trying to open up an account, which ends up getting robbed while she's in it, and we find out some nefarious business is about with this young lady in tow, but she is definitely doing something that shouldn't be doing. Is bad business to do that kind of stuff. And that brings us back to Saeed and Shannon, who he's gone to help translate some of the words that are on the maps that he brought back from Rousseau. He knows that she speaks French and looks for her to help him. And she thinks that it's a joke by Boone, that he's trying to get her, get a joke on her or something. And Saeed is obviously not that type of person. He's there because he actually needs the help that he's asking for. And it's interesting, we see him there later on, kind of being the only person who supports Shannon and says he believes that she can do it when they're trying to get these words translated. He wants to know what they mean, so that if they connect to the mathematic equations and the maps, that maybe it can help him map out the island or know what's going on more. But yeah, for the first time ever, we've seen somebody actually be supportive for Shannon, not just tell her she's useless or chastise her for what she's not doing. And I think, that's why she responds really well to Saeed in this episode. We want to switch now to Rose going over to Charlie to tell him to basically get up off his ass and start to help out, because they've all been through trauma and they all have to pitch in because it's tough. He just survived death twice, and why is this time the time that he's gonna sulk? And she tells him to get his ass in gear and to help out. And I think Rose is really cool as a character because we don't see much of her, but when we do see her, we see her as a very calm and collected person who's sort of like the voice of the people, of the survivors that we don't see a lot of. We have a name and a face to her, but she isn't always going to be the featured one, but gives us a good insight on the temperament and the mood of how everybody else is feeling, because we see very much a representation of how they're feeling through her. I noticed that this time around, that she's sort of the voice of the people in the background, the extras whose faces we never really see or names we don't really hear, aside from Scott and Steve. I like going to this next scene here, Kate trying to steal the case from Sawyer. The music again here shifts and is really different, going from sort of like sneaking and fun to playing around. It just, again, really, really interesting the way the music plays in this episode. Something I noticed a little bit more in this episode than I did in previous watches of this show. But Sawyer does catch up to her, offers her the case if she just tells him what's in it. At this point, he just wants to know why. And for some reason, Kate, being as stubborn as she is, can't just tell him what's in the case. Like, maybe she's too guarded, and that's what we're seeing in this episode, that she's just very locked up and hidden in her secrets because she can't trust anybody, maybe because of the type of person that she's been, as we find out in this episode, because we see her being a part of this bank raid, and she's actually in on it, and we find out later in the episode is the one who orchestrated it and knows what's in there and is trying to get something specific. So we see that little bit of Kate maybe being a little bit more of what Sawyer said about knowing girls like her than maybe we realized, because she does some stuff in this episode that's very similar to Sawyer, and I want to get to that in a little bit more, but for the sake of leaving you guys in suspense, let's talk a little bit more about Kate and Jack. Here in this scene, we see Kate now going to Jack about the issue with the case and trying to get him to help her recover it from Sawyer, telling him what's inside of it, but he doesn't necessarily believe that she is being forthright about what's in the case. He thinks that there's an ulterior motive. She has something else in there because that's how she is. He's gotten a pretty good sense for how Kate is and how she tends to manipulate people, and that is pretty much confirmed by the interaction that we also see her have with this boyfriend that she gets to help her rob this bank, and how stupid he was for following along with her. But we see Jack recognizing when he's going to be conned with Kate, and almost points it out, puts a stipulation on it, trying to be like, hey, I can tell. You have a chance to just tell me. You should just tell me. And so that comes into play a little bit later, because they end up having to go dig up the marshal's body to try to get the key, because Kate knows that there is a key in his back pocket for that case, and so Jack just has to get the case from Sawyer, and then he will be able to open up the case. But they also have to go excavate the body of this poor marshal, and we'll get to that in a second. But real quick, wanted to bring up a conversation that happens in between between Charlie and Rose, and she talks about asking for help from somewhere else, and then you have the hard cut to the cross that we see is where the marshal is, and he's on his own. Jack buried him himself, and that's now the second very overtly Catholic connection that we've seen for Charlie in 2 episodes. That kind of arched over here, and probably we'll see again. So keep on the lookout for stuff like that. And what they sort of connect with when they do that, because it is a tombstone. And it is asking for faith, and maybe it's his missing the tombstone, and not being the one buried underground, but it's a very interesting cut to have right after Rose suggests faith to Charlie. So I did want to point that out to you guys and have you pay attention to it. Now going back to when they dig up the marshal, and Kate is trying to pocket the key from Jack's view so that she doesn't have to open the case around him. And Jack is not an idiot. Jack isn't this person that we saw her take advantage of to get her into this bank. And he calls her on it and is pretty upset about it. But I wanted to point out, obviously, the parallels that they're drawing here between the people that Kate has conned in the past and somebody and the new people that she's met on the island, these 2 new love interests of Jack, who is giving her the opportunity to come clean and it seems like just come clean and be a better person moving forward, because they have that opportunity on the island. While you have Sawyer, who can sort of accept her for who she is, because he knows that she is like him, and obviously cons people, because we see Kate break into a bank and hold up a manager and everything, all to get a safety deposit box. And inside that box, we find out that there is something very valuable to her. And that safety deposit box is the same number as the flight 815. So yes, if you guys notice that is a connection. Things like that are not a mistake. Pay attention to numbers, because they come back a lot in this show, but it's definitely something to pay attention to. And so we see Kate turning on her boyfriend, shows us that she obviously knows how to use a gun, where she's now lied twice that she doesn't. So little subtle things like that. She had no reason to lie about knowing how to use a gun when she was there with the polar bear and taking it off of Sawyer. But now we see that she's obviously very comfortable with a gun. And she mentioned earlier on that she used to go hunting with her father. So of course she knows how to use a gun. Very, very interesting to see how they kind of peppered that bluff in when her guard is down, and she is being genuine with people. And then I do want to talk about the bluff that Jack really puts heavy onto Sawyer, into him giving him the case. I thought that was a really interesting exchange. We see Jack for the first time kind of acting more like Sawyer, again, minimizing that barrier between the two of them being so different. We see that they're very much alike, that Sawyer and he aren't really dissimilar. When things need to get done, Jack will get it done. He threatens him with not giving him biotics, but Sawyer feels like sort of twisting the knife, feeling like he lost, knowing that he's being played as well, through Kate, or through Jack by Kate, twists the knife and talks about how Jack knows or tells him about what Jack already knows, which is that she lied to him so that he would get the case, and that she is using him because he knows that would mess with him. Whether or not he already knew it, he knows that would mess with him. And I wanted to point that out to see that little interesting triangle that is building between the three. So Jack, now having the case and the key, brings the case to Kate, and they open it together. We find out that it's a little plane inside that belonged to the man that she loved or killed, or maybe both, but that's about all the information we get, and we see her very emotional and very genuine for the first time, I think, ever in this show, since being afraid in the bamboo trees when they were running away from the monster. But yeah, we see her very distraught here. One thing I wanted to point out, I don't know if you guys sort of caught it, or not caught it, but had the same feeling as I did about Jack in this episode. Sometimes Jack could be a little prissy bitch. And this ties back into his episode with his dad when he thought he knew what he was doing and trying to, reprimand his father for being drunk on the job. And I think he's trying to carry that across here, ooh, I'm going to do what's best for everybody, and I'm going to put you in your place. And I just think he's being a total bitch here. Tell me if you disagree. Like I said, I would love to hear that. Sorry, I just hit the microphone with my book. But yeah, just want to point out, really just a bitch in this whole exchange with Kate the whole episode. I want to go back to Rose and Charlie, now really talking about Faith. Not often do I get super emotional during scenes, but I felt like it's so interesting to see how well with the music here and the theme of faith and what it does mean for people, and how important it is when you some people meditate, some people pray, some people run, whatever it is. For these two people, it happens to be religion and faith. And you see faiths come up a lot in this show, and I'll try to point them out as often as I can. But here's one for Catholicism. You see these two Catholics, and she prays for him, and that's really kind of a moving scene and really emotional. And I don't care what your preference is in this case. You're watching a show about two people interacting in a scene on a human level, and in this scene, I feel like it really connects to just sometimes you feel like there has to be something else because you don't have any control over your life. Maybe. And these people have that in their life, and it's Catholicism and God, and you see them pray. And I think the way that this is shot with them pulling up and him being cradled by her in her arm, and the emotion that they have behind it, and him openly crying for the first time, having, dealt with the drug addiction and being strung up. It's a really moving scene, and the way it's shot with the lighting and everything, it seriously looks like a painting. I was really impressed by how it was shot. And that's one of the many things about the show that's really intriguing, is the way that it's shot. It's really dynamic and interesting and different than a lot of TV was at the time. And it's really cinematic. It makes you feel like you're watching a big movie and a big production. And shots like this, it really shows. It felt like a painting. And the ending scene that follows has this emotion that drives the show, that you really feel like these are people and individual characters that have their own issues and things that they need to work out for themselves to be better people. And you're watching the human condition here on this island, these people going from surviving to trying to live and trying to settle in on this island, having to move up the beach with the tide coming in, and them needing better shelter so that their stuff doesn't get washed out. You just see these people in their humanity here. And I think that that's a very cool emotion at the end of this episode, and the music really drives that and brings out that emotion very, very well. So speaking of music, we go to our last scene, the last thing I'll talk about for whatever the case may be, which is Shannon discovers that song is a nursery rhyme that she heard when she was a child. And I looked it up for you guys. I'm not going to get too much into the references. Like I said, I'll tend to stay away from explaining all the references when the information's all just out there, because it's easier for you guys if you want to read it to go find it than it is for me to tell you. But the name of that song is La Mer. It's a French song. La Mer means the ocean, and it's very interesting lyrics. There's also, for me, because I've studied French when I was in high school, and I know that I'm wrong about the word here because it's not the same, but I feel like they may have had this connection. If you're talking about your mother or somebody's mother, you can call them ma mère, which would be my mother, or ton mère. I don't know. I forget the conjugation, but mère is the same word. So here, when we have a mother being abducted with her child and them being on an island, those both have strong connections. The ocean or the mother, perhaps, who knows? But I did want to point that out because that might be a bit to remember. So that will take me into our emails, or take us into our emails. Again, I'm very, very excited that you guys keep sending in your emails with your questions, your thoughts, your theories, anything that you guys want. Send them in to me. wegobackpodcast@gmail.com. Always love to hear your guys' feedback on the episodes that are coming up. So I want to start off with an email here from Andrew. He says, when I first started watching the show, I always thought it was really interesting that the first thing Jack interacts with is Vincent. By that point, we don't know the dog belongs to someone on the island already. Anyway, it's always been curious why it was the first thing, and he wonders what the dog could represent, if the breed has any significance, or what it could mean when the dog is compared to Jack. When I first read this email, I thought maybe it didn't really have anything too significant, but what I considered here is that Jack's name is Jack Shepherd. And a shepherd always has a sheepdog. And while that dog is not necessarily a lab or a golden retriever, it might be, I'm not sure, he does basically guide him to his flock, or guide the flock to him. And I think that might be a symbolism that you can pick up from there. I'm not sure. That could be too much of a reach, but it's something that you see. And Vincent is a very interesting character as the show goes along. We'll pay more attention to him. I'll try to see a little bit more about what he's doing. I never really focused on him as a character, but he's always been prominent in the show. So, Andrew, thank you for that email. We will definitely talk more about Vincent and Jack, but for now, I think that's the best answer that I can give you. Right now, I want to talk about Ryan, who sent an email that was the reason I paid attention to the music in these two episodes a little bit more. He talks about how this show has the best music of any show that he's ever heard, and I would agree with him. It really has some incredible music. I mean, you have to think about who Michael Giacchino is now compared to even where he was at the time. I mean, he's been doing all the Pixar movies. He's done all the J.J. Abrams movies, and he's going to do so much more, and all of his scores are incredible. He does a bunch of rides for Disneyland. So strong ties with Disney, good place to be for him. I think he might even do the Marvel movies. I'm not sure if he does them all, but I know he does a lot. And you had this guy doing every episode of Lost, and the music is so cool. So Ryan, I'm so happy you're also paying attention to that in this show, because it made me pay a little bit more attention to it this time. And I'm seeing it a lot more. And yeah, so thank you for for writing that in and giving me a little bit more to look for myself. Again, this is one of the coolest things about watching Lost, is when somebody points out something and you kind of do want to go back and watch that episode again to see if you agree or disagree with them, or to notice it somewhere else if you maybe didn't. And there's a lot to pick up on. If we did a rewatch, which would be insane, that'll just be us talking in person. If you guys ever want to meet in person or talk online, we can do conversations that way that are a little bit more spoiler, because I want to keep it to these episodes. But yeah, that's the coolest thing, is that you guys have this input and it makes me go looking into this episode with a different view. So Ryan, I really appreciate that you sent that in and made me pay more attention to it. You were also the one who did notice as well that 815 is the same number of the flight as is on the safe deposit box. So really cool. Love that you point out the little details as well, like the maggots in the wallet, which would totally be there for a dead body, and Claire trying to pocket the key as part of her personality. Really, really cool to have that in there. And then I wanted to also bring up an email by Omar. Very good thoughts from Omar. Let's get right into this. For all the best Cowboys have daddy issues, he says, I thought it was interesting that in the flashback it showed Jack as the clear-headed one in the surgery room in comparison to his drunk father, and the island paralleled this by showing Locke thinking clearly to be the hunter and Jack being drunk, in quotes, off emotion in the search of Charlie and Claire. Jack is acting on impulse rather than using scientific fact to dictate his choices, as Locke is correct in that Jack is the only trained physician on the island. He is too valuable to risk losing. Jack's life isn't the only life at stake. If he dies, the other survivors are in great danger without him. I think that's a very interesting point. It talks a little bit more, or shows more of of an example of what I was saying about perspectives and thinking what they know, what they know what is right, but they don't have that same perspective as somebody else. You can see Jack thinking he's got that same righteousness that he had when he was with his father, but he's not being that way in this moment. He's very manic. He's not in a good state. And then we also have Omar writing about whatever the case may be. He said, I noticed this only after watching it now in a non-marathon format, that this episode really made no mention of looking for Claire. The only one who mentioned Claire was Boone, and only saw him and Locke were looking for Claire to cover up what they were really doing. You'd think that Claire would be the primary concern after this last episode, since Jack said he will go looking for her as soon as the sun comes up. Did they try searching for her and just give up? I don't know why Jack would be willing to dig up a grave for Kate with Claire missing on mind, especially by how so emotionally driven he was in the last episode. Maybe this episode takes weeks after the kidnapping. Maybe everyone believes Locke and Boone are out there actively searching. Please tell me if I'm missing something there. I don't think you're missing anything. I think it just wasn't as prominent for this episode as it needed to be, and that's just something that happens in TV sometimes. I think it's kind of mentioned, but there's other stuff going on, and so it doesn't really come through. And then you have sort of like Locke and Boone are the ones out looking for her, and Jack kind of maybe with a clearer head after the trail has gone, has returned to the beach and to the caves to try to help out there. I think that's all it is. I wouldn't read too much into that. Sometimes you just have to move away from that story also to get people to forget about it. So when you come back to it later, it's like, oh, right, what's going on with Claire? So it might be a story device. Everyone, thank you so much for sending in your emails. Again, always send those thoughts, theories, any questions that you have to wegobackpodcast@gmail.com, and follow me on Twitter at King Lord Bryan, and I'll always put up little updates there for what new episodes are coming out. I've set up a YouTube archive. There will be a link in the video or in the description for that, so that you can see the episodes 2 weeks older and back. And otherwise, just send me all your emails, wegobackpodcast@gmail.com. Let me know what you guys think. Happy to go through this with you guys. Happy to read what you have to say. Next week, we will be covering the 13th and 14th episode, which is Hearts and Minds and Special. So that's getting us almost halfway through the season 1. Man, we're moving through this quick. It's only 6 weeks. All right, guys. Thanks for tuning in. Really appreciate all of the support from you guys. I'll see you next week.